All right.
And also with you.
Okay, let's get started. All right, so we're talking about Titus. I hope be honest, did everyone do the reading?
Yes.
That's good. Only like 16
It's like 3
words.
pages.
Pretty nice. Not even a whole page. Pretty good. Pretty good. And you know what? Next week, even less reading. So that's pretty good.
More questions, but less reading.
More questions? Well, that's interesting. So fundamentally, this is a very different reading, obviously, than Revelation last time. A little bit easier to track with what's happening. At least looks quite a bit easier. It's pretty straightforward. So we're going to talk a little bit about who Titus was, just to make sure we're clear, because his background as a Greek makes quite a bit of a difference. His sort of perspective and what he is trying to do, what he's tasked to do, is different, and the way he approaches it is also different too. So we know Titus, I lovingly call him Paul's little buddy. Because we know he walked with Paul and hung out with him quite a bit, went with him to a couple of different places and was tracking. And then Paul drops him off on the island of Crete and says, good luck. That's basically what happens. So then we have his instructions to him and saying, hey, this is what you need to do, this is how you're going to do it, and this is a little bit of why. We got people are handing out the handouts for next week, which is great. We'll want to keep those. What I briefly wanted to do is have in mind just a very, very brief sketch of the chapter. Again, it's not a lot, but just to have in our mind what's happening. The opening verses is Paul's introduction, his little greeting and salutation. This is very familiar to all of Paul's letters. He introduces himself, says, hi, I'm Paul, I'm a follower of Christ. How's it going? Pretty straightforward. Although he does make a specific claim here that he doesn't do in his other letters, that he refers to God as one that does not lie, which is kind of significant. And then he goes into and gives his qualifications for an elder or a leader or a priest. And then finally, he kind of goes in hard on the Cretans and gives us, some colorful language to describe them as vile, slothful creatures and the like, which is great fun. To have in mind, again, we're talking, as long as you're not a Cretan. Hopefully no one's a Cretan. Just have in mind, this is just kind of fun, just a fun little visual aid for us as we're picturing this island with a fair bit of people on it, not to be confused with Lake Grapevine, the Mediterranean Sea, but that's okay. And so he's saying here, there's a fair number of people, there's a big influence in the Greek world. This is part of the Greek world. And so their understanding of the world comes into play. But I got ahead of myself. Sorry about that. So Titus is a Gentile. He doesn't have the same Jewish background or upbringing that Paul does either. And this is significant because one of the main things that Titus is tasked with doing is going in and sort of being the referee for some of these people that are sort of conflating some Jewish laws and trying to apply them inappropriately. For what it's worth, 2 Corinthians mentions Titus being with Paul a couple of times, but he doesn't get named in Acts, just for what it's worth. One of the things that, at least as I was reading through it, that Paul espouses is a very hopeful message. That in his description of what a leader or a presbyter, we'll kind of use those terms a little bit interchangeably, there's a lot of hope and optimism and there's just a lot of joy in what he is hoping for and asking Titus to go find these virtuous men, these leaders, to be such wonderful leaders of the community. And hopefully, you kind of missed the boat by bringing people like me and Father John here, but we're doing what we can. Looking at all of the qualifications, these should be somewhat straightforward. I don't think anyone's going to look at these and think, we want our leaders to be, loving good things and not arrogant. I don't think anyone's going to squabble at that. It's worth noting that this is basically the same list that Paul gives in 1 Timothy. These collection of epistles of Titus, 1 and 2 Timothy are sometimes called the pastoral epistles, because Paul is writing to homeboy Titus and then Timothy and giving some kind of sound wisdom and application. So this is what he has to say. Again, I don't think any of us would be terribly surprised by these, but in it, undergirding all this is such a strong appeal for having people that are in charge of building up this community too, that we want them to be loving the good, to love God above all else. And we say all these things, but he really, really means it. I found some more eloquent words that I want to share describing this. So using this as inspiration that I want you to hear. This is describing one of these leaders. One that seeks to build relationships rather than steal market territory. He does not try to force his agenda down the throats of others. He wants peace, community, and unity. He trusts God to bring it to pass. The overseer is one who enjoys the company and fellowship of others. He's not a CEO who isolates himself, but is among the faithful, teaching them the Word of God and praying with them. He is also one who opens his heart and home to the needy, physically and spiritually. He loves what is good and hates what is evil. He is very set in his ways about God and honoring him. His heart rejoices in the truth and when truth prevails. He is sensible, exercising good judgment and having the ability to exercise wisdom in a variety of situations. Sensible also carries the meaning of temperate or sane, implying that the overseer is well balanced, disciplined, and of sound mind and demeanor. I can go on. And it's really beautiful, and it gives me, a fair bit of both hope and optimism, but a fair bit of humble pie. I'm like, oh man, the bar is pretty high for myself. Now, what Titus is tasked to do is enter into the situation where we have this idea that there's Christians gathering and trying to worship God and bring people up into the faith. We're thinking this is roughly 30-ish years after Jesus' death. So there's a fair bit of Christianity going around. However, there's also a fair bit of false doctrine of people sort of conflating different ideas. The most notable thing, the very first church council, if you've ever heard of the Second Vatican Council in the 60s and 70s or so, throughout history, the church is gathered to sort of decide on doctrine. We call these ecumenical church councils. And the very first one is recorded in the book of Acts in chapter 15. That took place around 48 or 50 A.D. And the chief the chief topic of discussion was, what do we do with all this Jewish history and culture and stuff? And we have all these new people that are brought into sort of God's family, but they aren't Jewish. Jesus came for everyone, fulfilling the law, but not quite getting rid of it, but fulfilling it. But how does this actually all play out? And there's a couple of people that were really adamant that they wanted everyone to have to follow all the same laws, but that's not what Jesus said. And so the sort of decision that came out of it, the merry band of, these weren't the only people there, but some of the prominent apostles were there that helped decide, this is what this means, that people that weren't under the law before, don't have to follow it all the same. So the inference that Titus is getting himself into here in Crete is that there's a couple of people that are trying to force Greeks to follow all the same law. And so Titus has to go and say, no, you can't do this. Is that surprising to anyone? Hopefully not. That's pretty straightforward. What Paul also recognizes is that, like, the island of Crete and the people there are not exactly known for being, like, the best of people. There's a reason, I'm sure this joke came up, that we have this word of being a Cretan is sort of this, like, negative connotation for this kind of nasty kind of person. And there's a great little line in there that I kind of mentioned about being woeful, I forgot how he said it. But it's very colorful language, and you describe them being lying and deceitful. Cicero mentions this too in his own writings that talks about this group of people that are not great. So they get associated with greed and all the rest. Now, Greek mythology and the world and how it worked. And so there's some thought that some people were trying to assimilate Christian doctrine and belief and ideas with their Greek mythological outlook. And so the logical connection that some people saw was, hey, that Jesus guy, he's kind of Zeus-like, which is where we get this wonderful comparison that I found, that I appreciate that. That in my own mind, I'm picturing what Titus had to go in and say, hey guys, these aren't the same people. And that's just pure humor. This is the more accurate picture to describe one of the things that was trying to happen. And it comes down to Paul, in this whole writing, this is what matters to us, is that what they believe actually matters. And just because some of it sounds close enough, okay, there's some type of God person that can do miracles and have powers, but if you know anything about Greek mythology, you know that all the gods are completely morally depraved and just not good people. But that's part of the joke of it all. It seems so silly to us, knowing the Christian God who, as Paul first introduced himself, God is literally truth. He does not lie. And one of the themes, or one of the ways we read Scripture, is that the whole thing has been one long promise of truth. From the very beginning, one of the things we tell, the little 2 to 4-year-olds is that God keeps his promises. And we see that starting at the beginning of creation up through Revelation as well. And one of the challenges is to recognize what the challenges Titus faced, and the challenge for us too, is to see when ideas sound like they could almost work, how that they can't, that we can't hold two things that are at odds with each other at peace. If they are at odds, then you have to let go of one. And the hope is that we hold on to God, the one that is all truth. Now, one of the things that is really striking to me, again, reading through Paul's description of what it means to be an elder and what are the qualifications for it, is that it's a pretty high bar. And it's funny because the rest of the clergy, we've been at a clergy retreat the last couple of days, and sort of the theme has been a series of addresses reflecting on sainthood and the Christian vocation to the priesthood, and sort of the humble and immense weight that is, but the great blessing that is, the challenge of seeing, of recognizing what other people see in you that you can't quite see in yourself, but for some reason people say this about you. But all this has application beyond just the priesthood too. But I do have a joke here that some of you may have known, or I may have told this to you before, but this hopefully has some application to the conversation. So, this is a picture of the church right here. It's not the best contrast, I apologize. This is the pulpit here, sometimes called the ambo, and up here we have this little wooden structure that's designed to help project the sound, but it has two names that I know of. Does anyone know either of the two names? Tester? Ooh, I like that. We have three names. I like Tester. I'm most often heard it called a baldachin or baldachin. Doesn't matter. It's an old thing. The other one, this is a more important name for it, is that it's a solution to too long of a sermon. Not my joke, but I'm going to keep using it. Now, one of the things that comes to mind, and it's worth sort of reflecting on just a moment, as we're reading, Paul's letter from 1900 years ago, that all of his expectation for the right order for things that matter, which is things of God, that they matter and that we treat them very carefully and preciously, that we don't just haphazardly let anyone come in and teach and talk about whatever, that we sort of have the same safeguards in place to today, whether it be coming from either. That technically you have to be licensed by the bishop or licensed by the diocese, by proxy the bishop, and this is a direct fulfillment of what Paul is writing about, of having this sort of ordering of things that you have, whether it be, in the Greek, the presbyteros, that eventually there's some other words, that's where we get episkopos, which is where we get bishop, which is just an overseer. All it is just an overseer. And I was reflecting the other day upon one of the ordinations that I went to a long time ago that was at St. Lawrence. You might remember a previous priest who used to hang out here, Father Cooper, when he was ordained to the priesthood. We remember him very fondly. Bishop Iker was giving the sermon, and in this moment he was sort of directly addressing Cooper. And he said something to the effect of, Cooper, never forget the trust that you have been given. Both the trust that the people have in your leadership, your role, but also the trust of the fellow clergy as well. And I was reflecting on this, being surrounded by all the other clergy in the diocese the last couple of days, of the great blessing, but also the weight of trying to uphold all of the same faith and tradition and all of the stuff, that it's not something to be taken lightly, which is why we look up every now and then and you're like, oh man, that thing's going to fall down at any given moment. So it's a good humble piece of humble pie for us as the priest too.
Kind of like being struck by lightning?
Very much so. Very, very much so. The great challenge, I think, for all of us is to see how, let me strike that from the record. That was poorly phrased. Thinking about sort of the expectations and the qualifications for what being a leader is, and that term gets changed and adapted a little bit. By about 107, there's a letter from some guy by the name of Ignatius of Antioch, and he's one of the first main ones that writes down bishop, priest, and deacon. That's where we get the threefold order. But before, they were just kind of elders and presbyter were kind of used interchangeably. And they were used sort of as a bridging point between the Jewish communities and these new Christian communities. That the idea of an elder, and I'm forgetting the Hebrew now, it's like zakin or something like that, was a familiar term and a familiar idea of having someone to look up to. And so it was a natural sort of correlation or connection to then call basically what would be the same kind of person having the same job or role in this slightly new context. And then over time, then you get priest from presbyterate. So there's that. The last thing I wanted to reflect on for just a moment is thinking about how all of us are tasked with being leaders ourselves. Or rather, how all of us as Christians are tasked with carrying on the witness, the testimony of Jesus Christ himself, and that it's not just for the priests. I know it's a shocker to some, but it's not. I was at lunch the other day with some friends, and we were just sitting around, and I said, I'll bless the food. And one guy goes like, well, that's your job. So yeah, and I said, well, okay, I guess it is my job, but it's also your job too. It's a little bit more visible of a job when I go out to places. But as a Christian, all of us are charged with bearing witness to Christ everywhere too. So that's a little appeal from Paul to all of us, whether you're on this beautiful island that's a lot more beautiful than, I mean, like Grapevine's beautiful too, but it's an appeal for all of us to recognize the promise given by God and to live out the life of truth and to take it seriously. To take it very, very seriously because it matters. What we believe is going to be reflected in what we do. One of the things that's undergirding sort of all those stipulations of being a bishop or a priest, or some of those are more like outward signs, but they are also reflective of sort of within of the character. And the belief is that you can't have one without the other. If you truly believe all of the stuff and truly love God and want to spread the kingdom, then it will naturally spill over in all these areas of your life. But if it doesn't, then there's some question there. So the great challenge is for all of us to try to live up to the same qualifications too. Any questions about that? Or any other burning questions? Yes. No.
So a lot of times you'll hear both sides of this thing that I'm about to say. You'll hear people who say it's our job to live up to Christ's example equally as
Mhm.
much as it is any priest's job.
Mhm.
And you'll hear people say, well, it's our job to try, but it's the priest's job to be
To
more
do
of an example, to do it
Yeah.
more, to do
Yeah.
it, you know.
Mhm.
The standard is higher.
Sure.
What would you say to that discussion?
I would first say both are true, which is a little bit of a cop-out answer. It's tricky because and I say this, being on this end of the conversation, that I don't see the sort of task being that much different. When you look at sort of what's talked about in Scripture, what Jesus himself says and does, we're told to do the same. The only caveat to that is that sort of my answering that call, if you will, is a little bit more visible in public because it gets associated with things that a good Christian should do, and if they fail to do so, that in theory is a poor reflection on all of Christianity. But for the most part, I think most people kind of have some disassociation with that, and they think, well, they're not necessarily going to put that blame on the rest of the church. But if someone in some leadership position does, then you would put more blame on them.
Okay,
That's
so
a good question. Yeah.
in James, on that,
Yes.
in James 3, it says, "Not many of you should become teachers, serving as an official teacher capacity, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who are teachers," which I always associated that with priests,
Yeah.
"will be judged by a higher standard because we have assumed greater accountability and more condemnation if we teach incorrectly." So that's kind of where, when you were saying that, that's where I
Yeah,
got that.
well, no, and that's true, which brings up another great point about it, is that part of having the duty to also be responsible for teaching and like helping other people come to faith and come to understanding where, if you don't have the same vocation or the same degree, then you do have a little bit of a get out of jail free card, like, well, I didn't know what I was not supposed to know, To be fair, I wouldn't use that in the court of law or the court of whatever you want to call it, but there is more weight taken on. So I think that's a good point, and James does point that well to us.
But on the other hand,
Yeah.
when we're talking about, Peter said, or not, sorry, in 1 Peter he says, "But you're not like that, for you're a chosen people, royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light." So we're all priests in our own way.
Priesthood of all believers, right? Well, and because it's a fulfillment of Israel. Israel itself is called to be this set apart thing that stands out in great contrast to the rest of the world, and Christians, it's sort of the natural fulfillment or continuation of that too. But it's tricky to do so. But that's sort of what we're asked and called to do, certainly. I had another thought, but it went away.
Sorry.
No, it's
Well,
okay.
then I thought about, and that's just kind of a segue off of what I just said. When we were reading in there, we was talking about, that people should be educated so that they can teach. Where was it? When people are worse, then you need more people that understand.
When teachers, we have more false teachers than we need.
More true.
More true teachers.
And so I said, that's what we're doing now, is trying to learn the truth so that we can be truth teachers.
We do want everyone to be truth teachers
You know,
too.
it's almost a condemnation in a way to say that when a leader in the church doesn't set a good example, the world sees that as reflecting on Christianity. And when your average Christian doesn't set a good example,
Right.
the world doesn't see that as reflecting on Christianity. That's almost a condemnation of the.
It is. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. We all do. We certainly all do. The last little other note, thinking just a little bit more about James, is the idea that, just to make it clear that some are called but not all are, and that's not any slight against anyone whatsoever, or it's not envisioned to be at all. Just truly that some people are called and some people are not. That doesn't, mean you're any bad or worse of a person if you're not called into this role at all. There's a little bit of freedom in that to know. Part of my own discernment process, starting when I was 11 through 22 or so, and to today, now 30. As of Saturday, I didn't turn every day.
Wow, what a milestone.
So hard. I know it's coming back. The train is
Lean on the chair.
coming back to the same. Part of that discernment process is a lot of prayer, but part of it is praying with other people, praying and having them pray with and for, and the expectation is that they'll help you discern with God, so to speak. And that I jokingly told some people throughout the years, as I would say, I'm not really sure, and they're like, well, do you want to be a priest or not? I'm like, well, it's not really up to me. And if someone had said no, then it would have been a lot easier. Then I would have said, oh, okay. But again, that's because it's not a good or bad thing to be called or not called. It's just what God is calling you to do. So just wanted to make one little asterisk of a note. Cool. Anything else? All right, let's say a prayer and get on our way.